Wow, my career leading up to Sid and Nancy, I was born on the Wirral Peninsula. I went to school there. I went to Oxford and I was a law student. After I finished there, I went to Bristol University and I got a certificate in radio, film and television studies and a Fulbright scholarship to go to UCLA. And I was at UCLA for 3 years as a graduate student. Have an MFA from UCLA, became a screenwriter, wrote a screenplay for United Artists, did a screenplay for two friends of mine who'd been at UCLA with me called Repo Man, which we made in Los Angeles in 1983. And in 1984, I started work on the Sid and Nancy screenplay with Abby Wall, who I'd also been at UCLA with. And the film went into production in 1985.
Come back, we've got a domestic violence report on 21st Street between 6 and 7. Chelsea Hotel. Domestic violence at Chelsea Hotel.
Car 222, we got a 911 report coming in. Nearest unit, please respond. DV report, domestic violence, Chelsea Hotel. 23rd Street.
The script came about because I had a meeting with a producer about another film that I was trying to make. And he said en passant that some studio was talking about making a film about Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, which is going to star Rupert Everett and Madonna. And because I was very into the punk scene, I was a real enthusiast for the punk scene. I was, needless to say, horrified at the thought of this, absolutely horrified. Because at that point, Rupert Everett hadn't really established himself as a good actor, which he did later become. But especially the thought of Madonna, you know, faking it as some kind of a punk rocker, you know, was just so awful. And so I told Abby, who was also very into the punk scene, and we'd been students together at UCLA and had seen many shows on the West Coast, obviously. I told her about this, and I said, don't you think we should write a screenplay, you know, about this and try and get it on, if only to thwart the Madonna project, you know. And so she agreed, and so for no money, she and I started writing it. We went to the Chelsea Hotel for a while and stayed there to write it so we could get the kind of the vibe, you know. And when the screenplay was finished, we were really fortunate because at that time there was a film production entity called Zenith, which was a branch of Central Television. And they had a very forward-looking executive producer, Margaret Matheson. And Margaret greenlit Sid and Nancy as a project that Zenith would make. And then they went out and found the American partner who provided the other half of the funds. I was very enthusiastic about the punk movement. I mean, I wasn't ever a part of the scene here because when I was in Bristol, I was aware of it because there was a band in Bristol called the Cortinas. And I remember one time, the year must have been 1976, walking down the street and seeing a young lad walking down the street with a leather jacket, and written on the back of the leather jacket was 1976. And I thought, oh, this is very interesting. You know, this is fashion merged with something else, you know. And when I was in Los Angeles, the movement started taking off there, obviously after the English scene. But the punk scene in Los Angeles by the late 70s, early 80s was really quite strong and very interesting. There were some tremendous bands there, like Fear and Suicidal Tendencies, X, The Plugs, who did the music for Repo Man. And so I was kind of embedded in that scene and very enthusiastic about it. And then we'd see these bands when they came, you know, when the Clash came, you know, that was an exciting time, you know. And so we'd go see the Clash and at the Santa Monica Civic, or supporting the Who, you know, because they blew the Who off the stage, you know, and so yeah, we were very into the movement, you know, both as a musical movement, but also as a sort of a revolutionary movement, you know, the idea that it was something that really might change things. a little bit like the surrealists thought that their movement was more than just about painting. You know, it was actually about transforming society and taking the means of production into your own hands and not being dependent on corporations. And that was very exciting. And also, it was, and also over here, of course, it was also it was very anti-authoritarian. You know, there was a lot of people pissed off about the Royal Jubilee. It wasn't like last time when everybody's become docile now. But in 76, 77, you know, early 80s, there was a lot of politics around, and it was very exciting. Of course, the English punks derided the American punks because they would go, you middle-class kids, you don't know anything, you know. We're the ones who suffer, you know. But there was a lot of angst, you know, over there. There was a lot of feeling that things weren't right, you know, and that things could be greatly improved, because the Americans got an even bigger dish of the corporate pie than the British did at that time. It's all the same now. But in those days, there were a lot of pissed off people and a lot of very good artists that found their place within the punk movement. So it was very rebellious. I mean, I was there for the Elks Lodge Hall riot, you know, when the cops rioted, and they just went crazy and they attacked all these kids on the street and beat them with batons and all of this stuff. You know, it was a really heady time, and it really did feel like a movement, you know. I'm sure it was never the same as it was to be here in London and to be part of that Bromley contingent, you know. But nevertheless, it was a movement, and it was quite an exciting one. I started doing a lot of research for the script. So I met people who'd been part of the Bromley contingent, like Alan Jones and Debbie Wilson, you know, people who'd been part of not in bands, but just people who'd been part of that movement, you know, and interviewed them at length about it. And that led me to interview. Then they would give me contacts for other people, so I could talk to other people who'd been in the scene. And I amassed like a massive sort of amount of written material about it, you know, just by talking to people and writing in notebooks, all of which is now at the National Media Museum in Bradford in a vault somewhere. And it was it was fascinating. And it was really out of that research that we made the screenplay. So it was based on what we thought of as a fairly authentic version of those events. I think probably Abby and I tended to sentimentalize the characters. You know, we were probably too sentimental about them, the two principals. And even though we wanted to tell the story authentically, but I think we did get trapped a little bit in being a little overly sentimental about them. Yes, I was in touch with all of the members of the Sex Pistols, I think, although Cook and Jones I didn't know very well. Glenn Matlock was the musical director of the Sex Pistols scenes. Ironically, he'd been kicked out of the Sex Pistols because he wasn't cool looking enough. And he was the only person in the band at that time who could actually play an instrument, you know. But they'd kicked him out and brought in Sid instead because Sid looked so cool. And so Glenn got his revenge a few years later by recording all of the bass guitar tracks for the movie. So when you see Sid and Nancy, that's Glenn Matlock playing Sid Vicious's guitar and playing it deliberately badly, you know, because Glenn was a pretty good musician. So Glenn was totally involved in the project, and I had a really great meeting with John Lydon. I went to New York because we were going back and forth a lot in the casting process and location scouting. I went to New York, and John Lydon was staying at the Mayflower Hotel in New York, and I went and hung out with him for an afternoon, and we talked about the project. We talked about, you know, what the whole thing had meant to him and his relationship with Sid. And I think he had read the screenplay, and he had some very specific notes about it. I mean, and about how we should make the film. He felt that we should fictionalize it more because obviously in the script there was a Sid Vicious character, there was a Nancy Spungen character, there was a John Lydon character, Johnny Rotten character. And Lydon said that he thought that, especially after he met the actor who played him in the film, Drew Schofield, who's like a fantastic actor, Liverpool guy, Scouser, fantastic actor. And he met Drew and spoke to him, and he said to me, you know, you should play it differently. You should play it like my character's a Scouser. You know, you should play it like you know, it's the Sex Pistols, but it's a different Sex Pistols. It's like Drew Schofield, you know, and I started thinking, wow, that's an interesting way to go, you know, because maybe we could have Sid played by a woman, you know. And I was thinking about Sandra Bernhardt playing Sid. And the idea that then we would do a completely different version of the Sex Pistols. But in the end we didn't, and that's probably a weakness too, that instead we kind of went for an attempt at historical recreation rather than liberating ourselves the way that Lydon advised us.
Boring, boring. Boring, boring, boring. Exterminate! 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 Exterminate!
It was very recent, and imagine if you were in that situation. I mean, imagine that, you know, somebody you'd been very close to, a very, very close friend, you know, had died, and in horrible circumstances, and then 3 or 4 years later some guys come along, hey, we're going to make a movie about it, you know, and you're going to be a character, you know. I mean, no, it's super obnoxious, you know. And he was very generous to talk to us, you know, and to offer his counsel. I mean, I thought Lydon's a super smart guy, and and all the advice he gave us we should have followed, you know. I mean, the stories that I would hear from other people was that she was quite a dark influence in the whole story. But then you get into a situation where, because these people are real people and they're still alive, you really can't go, you know, risking a defamation lawsuit or something like that, you know. So it's complicated, because if people are real people, especially if they're public figures, you can make a film about them or write a book about them, but you still have to you have to sort of be careful about the way you put that together. And so we trod a very interesting and uneasy line, you know, throughout the screenwriting process and throughout the making of the film. Well, obviously we had to license Sex Pistols music. It was essential, you know, and we had to license My Way. It was essential. And then there were some other songs from the period, like Oh Bondage Up Yours, which we also licensed and recreated. So on the one hand, we were doing actual recreations of Pistols and other punk songs, and I Want to Be Your Dog by Iggy and something else, you know. So we licensed all these songs that they were actually that had been part of that story, in order to tell the story. But then as soon as we'd finished the English part of the shoot, before we went to the States to carry on with the filming over there, I met Joe Strummer, and I was a huge Clash fan. I mean, meeting Strummer was just incredible for me, you know, because I was such a fan of the Clash. And he said, well, listen, let's get together when you're done, you know, because you're editing in London. So when you come back, let's get together, you know. And I said, yeah, I'll show you the film. Okay, yeah. And so when we had a rough cut, I showed him the rough cut, and I said, do you want to write some music for it? And he goes, yeah, I'll write you some music, you know. And so officially, his record company would only let him write 2 songs for the film. But in fact, he wrote 5 or 6 songs, all of which appear on the track of the film or in the background of the film, like, say, a reggae song which plays when Sid and Nancy are in a recording studio together. And we put that in the credits under other names. So there are all these fake band names and fake credits, because it was all done by Strummer. And then there was also music by the Pogues, who I'd met in London, and music by a San Francisco band called Pray for Rain, that was run by my friend Dan Wool, who coincidentally was the brother of Abby. Well, the casting director was Lucy Bolting, a fantastic casting director based in London. And she introduced me to a whole bunch of actors. I mean, she, you know, all the English side of the casting was done by Lucy, and she had incredible taste, absolutely fantastic taste, and a very wide range of contacts that wasn't just film people, you know. I mean, she was very knowledgeable about television and very knowledgeable about the theatre. And she said, you know, there's this young lad that's in a play right now at the Barbican. You might want to go and see. And so I went and I saw Gary Oldman in one of the war plays at the Barbican. And even though he only had a small part, you know, and I thought, well, this is a pretty interesting actor. And so we met and we talked about it. And he'd done some TV at that time, but he hadn't done any film work. He was right at the beginning of his career, never made a film. And so in the end, the casting choice that Lucy had come up with seemed to come down to two actors, two British actors. One was Gary Oldman and one was Daniel Day-Lewis. And neither had made a film before. So what an interesting choice to have to make. And what a great choice to be given, you know. And in the end, we went with Gary. Chloe I met through an actor that I knew in Los Angeles called Miguel Sandoval. He and Chloe had been in a theatre company together. And Miguel said, listen, I know a woman who I think, you know, because they were bringing in actors to read for the various American roles, and Miguel was often reading opposite them, you know, to have another actor in the room and read the opposing dialogue. And after we'd read a number of, you know, really decent actors for the part of Nancy, Miguel said, you know, I think there's a woman I think you should meet, you know, who might be very good for it. And I was in a theatre group with her a few years ago. And so he introduced me to Chloe, and there was no doubt in my mind. It wasn't like there was somebody else as well, you know, who was equally good. It wasn't like having the choice between Gary and Daniel. It was like, this is Chloe. Chloe is going to play this part. It's obvious that she's got to do it, you know. She was perfect for it. I mean, she's perfect for many roles. She's a tremendous actor. But I was blown away by her audition and thought she was just right. No, I hired everybody. I'm an autonomous director. Nobody tells me what to do, you know. I mean, whoever the DP is on a film that I make, I choose the DP, you know, and I choose the editor, I choose the sound designer and the composer and the actors, you know. That's why I'm an anathema to certain people, is because I don't get given stuff, you know. I actually make the decisions. And I had seen, I think Roger had only made one film at that time, but he'd done TV work, and he came very highly recommended by Margaret Matheson of Zenith. I guess that she had probably worked with him on other projects. And so I met him and I really liked him. We hit it off really well. And I thought, well, you know, let's go for it, you know, because I always worked with different DPs. It was interesting. I never got into the sort of the routine of always working with the same cinematographer. Every film I did was a different one. And wow, we were lucky, weren't we? Because he turned out so good. And all the choices that he made were the right ones. In terms of lighting, even down to the lenses that he chose. He shot almost the entire film with two lenses, a 35mm, which is kind of slightly wide, and an 85, which is kind of slightly long. And my own instincts would be to go wider, you know, to go for a 28 or even a 24, and on the longs to go for 100 or 135. That would be my instincts. But Roger was right, because he understood lenses much better than I did, you know. And so again, you know, as with Gary and Chloe, we couldn't have had a better cinematographer than Roger. We were so lucky to get him at that stage in his career. I think that critically, it probably got the best response of all the films I've done. It was pretty well received critically, I think, both in Britain and in the US, although I think it was viewed differently in both countries. In England, I think they thought of it as a sort of a Sex Pistols docudrama, and in the States they thought of it as a love story. So it was interesting how a doomed and horrific love story, you know, but it was interesting how the two cultures viewed the film, the same artifact, differently. Our intention was not to glamorize being a junkie, you know, because Abby and I both felt that Sid and Nancy betrayed the movement by doing that. I mean, there they were, you know, on top of the world, Ma. I mean, they're in the most famous punk band of them all, and they degenerate from that into being junkie pop stars in a hotel room, you know, and it was disgraceful. And we felt it was disgraceful. And for us, the most important scene was the scene where the actor Cy Richardson, who plays the guy in the methadone clinic, who won't give them their methadone until he's given them a lecture about how they're screwing up, you know, and how they're betraying the movement. That for us was, for both of us, was the most important scene. And even though the scene's in the movie, I think it gets overbalanced by the end of the film, by the sort of the romantic and naive thing where the taxi comes and they go off to heaven in the taxi. And I think in retrospect, that was wrong. That ending was wrong, even though perhaps if we'd made the ending more brutal, if we'd just had Vicious die in a pool of his own vomit, you know, that would have been more truthful. But I don't know if the financiers would have gone for it. And so it's an interesting situation to find yourself in when you're attempting to do something that's really overt and clear, and yet somehow perhaps the meaning of the film and the message of the film, the message that these guys had betrayed the movement and betrayed themselves, you know, maybe got lost in that romantic ending. You remember how the Sex Pistols achieved fame and recognition. It was through notoriety and through controversy. And so John Lydon did us the greatest of favors. You know, if John Lydon had said, "Oh, great film, fantastic, love it," you know, he would have just seemed like a prat, you know, and a part of the in crowd, you know, and instead he condemned the film, said it was disgusting, and that was quite right. He should have said that. And of course, in doing so, he generated more controversy. And so that got people talking about the film. It interested people in the film and made them want to see it, you know. And so he did us, by condemning the film, he did the film an enormous good turn. And then, even while we were still editing the film, as I recall, he came out with an album called Album, or the CD was called CD. And he'd used the blue and white generic packaging from Repo Man as the album cover. And I thought that was just perfect, because we'd ripped off his life story, you know, shamelessly, you know. And so not only did he do us the favor of condemning the film, but he also ripped off Repo Man for his next project. So I've got nothing but respect for the man, you know. And I would love to see him again and embrace him warmly.